Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 19th of March 2012, the podcast that plumps when you cook it. This is your host, Shane Killian. First, a brief update with a clarification. Last week we discussed the case of Nigel Robinson, who found that he had inadvertently downloaded child porn to his computer when he meant to download a Slash album. Social services then prevented him from having anything other than supervised visitation with his daughter. From several of the comments and emails I've received about this story, it seems some people have got the wrong idea about this, so let's make this clear. The police are not to blame for this situation. They did not arrest Robinson, nor charge him with any crime, not even the illegal music download he confessed to. This was solely the doing of social services. And now, this ban has been lifted. After having 4 months of only supervised access to his daughter, the East Riding of Yorkshire Council has lifted the ban, and police will be returning his laptop as soon as the pictures are securely wiped. Of course, it's bogus that he was ever prevented from seeing his daughter to begin with, and they are still sending the message that if you ever see anything like this, just delete the files and keep your mouth shut. It's a broken system and one that hurts people. Now let's flame broil the news of the bogus. The oath of enlistment for the U.S. Armed Forces makes all servicemen and women duty-bound to, quote, support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It seems that far too few of them take this oath seriously, especially those last two words, and when one of them comes out and does, he finds his free speech rights abridged. Case in point, Marine Sergeant Gary Stein. On his Facebook page, he has never shied away from criticizing the Obama administration, especially its healthcare initiatives. In an online discussion about the Obama administration allowing NATO to try U.S. soldiers for burning the Quran, an action that is not and should not be illegal, Stein spoke out against it, saying that he would refuse to follow the orders of the Obama administration if they included things like detaining U.S. citizens or robbing them of their right to keep and bear arms. He refused to do anything that would violate the constitutionally guaranteed rights of U.S. citizens. Good for him. But a fellow Marine narked on him, and now he's finding himself under investigation merely because he said he would do what his oath requires him to do. Easy to see what the military higher-ups think about the Constitution. Easy as well to see what they do to officers and soldiers who make public statements they don't agree with. Stein said, quote, just because I'm a Marine doesn't mean I don't have free speech or can't say my personal opinion about the president or other public official just like anybody else. The Constitution trumps everything else. Right on, Stein, and the Constitution makes no exception for military personnel in the First Amendment or anywhere else it guarantees our rights. Now he's being prohibited by his superiors from using any social media sites. What a horrendous violation of his rights. While making it clear that he doesn't speak for the Marines or the U.S. Armed Forces, he said, quote, our armed forces place their life on the line for political agendas every day, and the thought that they should have no opinion about the political world is absurd. It's a shame that his fellow Marines don't share his sense of obligation to their oaths of enlistment, or they would know this is a very example of what Stein himself was talking about, and would be supporting and defending him against these domestic enemies, even if these enemies did outrank them. That would be true bravery. What's a good way to help the homeless? You might say, work in a soup kitchen, or donate to a shelter. Those are good things, but there's something even better, giving them jobs. No one could possibly deny that's a much better outcome. Well, no one except for whiny, free market-hating liberal douchebags who call it exploitation out of nothing more than their own dogmatism. Case in point, a program that's springing up in several cities called homeless hotspots. This is where homeless people are given 4G smartphones with Wi-Fi access enabled. The homeless person carries it around wearing a t-shirt featuring his name and instructions for getting the Wi-Fi network name and password. People who use the Wi-Fi donate whatever amount they think is reasonable, suggested $2 for 15 minutes, and the homeless person gets to keep the money, in addition to the $20 a day stipend they get from Front Steps Shelter. One of the groups behind this is BBH Labs, who cooperated with Front Steps to test the initiative for the Southwest Interactive Festival in Austin, Texas. They then found themselves, you'll never believe this, attacked by the liberal press. It started with, it figures, the New York Times, whose reporter David Gallagher called it dystopian and likened it to turning human beings into infrastructure. Luke Scheibler of the New York Daily News called it, quote, a shameful, hideous, patronizing, dehumanizing idea. Arnold Cohen, CEO of Partnership for the Homeless, said it's, quote, more than absurd, it's stomach-turning. Wired.com's Tim Carmody said that it, quote, symbolizes everything that's awful about living in America in the 21st century, and that the homeless who participated are, quote, walking, talking billboards for a program that doesn't care anything at all about them or their future. Numerous others followed, calling it shameful exploitation. Funny how the homeless don't see it that way. One of the homeless involved told shelter director Mitchell Gibbons, quote, these are the same people, if I were not participating in this program, who would walk past me and never stop to talk to me. But because I'm participating in this program, they're interested in who I am. This wouldn't happen any other way. Another participant, Jonathan Hill, said that it was a much better experience than having a job doing manual labor for the festival, since he got to interact directly with participants. Normally, the drunk, rowdy crowds that often result from these festivals result in harassment for the local homeless, but this way, having already seen and interacted with them, the crowds just don't do that. He also feels it's a good way of publicizing the issue of the homeless. See, the problem of the homeless isn't just money, it's that people don't notice them. They just pass them right by in the streets. Even people who volunteer at shelters and soup kitchens have limited interaction with the homeless. But this way, members of the public get to engage the homeless and have a positive experience dealing with them, and the people who interact with them do not see them as a piece of computer equipment, as the liberals bleat, but a real flesh and blood person with something of value to contribute to the world. I really cannot imagine how warped in the head someone would have to be to call this a bad thing. The homeless in question are not advertising any product. No product is even mentioned. Despite the claims of outraged liberals, there is no branding whatsoever. Only the homeless person's name is printed on the t-shirt, and the money is paid directly to the homeless person, who keeps 100% of it on top of the daily stipend. Liberals call it a stunt. The homeless call it a job. Maybe the liberals are just upset that these people are creating the jobs that their Lord and Savior in the White House can't, and helping the very people his policies have left behind. Here we have something that lets the homeless make money, providing a service to the public, and gets the public interacting with them face to face in an open and friendly environment. You'd think that the liberals would be applauding that. But once again, we see that their claim to be compassionate about the poor is just a front, and what they really care about is their hatred of the market and their love of government intrusions that caused the problem this program is trying to alleviate in the first place. Here's something to ponder. Who writes the worst software? Human beings are bad at writing secure software free of bugs, but some are worse than others. You may be tempted to say that Microsoft is pretty bad, but despite their reputation, they actually do quite well compared to the lowest of the low, the ones who write the buggiest, least secure software of all, the government. Computer security company Veracode has released an analysis of almost 10,000 applications, which it scanned for errors that could compromise the security or stability of a user's PC. One of the results that they found was that government software contained significantly more security flaws than their private counterparts. None of the news was that great. On average, only 28% of the commercial software applications they tested were secure. And of finance industry software, frighteningly, only 24% were secure. This shines light on a huge problem that needs to be addressed. But it pales when compared to government software programs, 80% of which were made for federal agencies, and only 16% of which were secure. For offline projects, it wasn't much better. Commercial software scored 34%, finance software 28%, and government software only 18%. Even something as straightforward as a SQL injection was a way to compromise 40% of government software, and 75%, 3/4 of government software, was vulnerable to cross-site scripting. The next time someone says we need government to make us secure, laugh right in that person's face. Research director Alan Poller says the problem is one of incentives. Isn't it always? Quote, The consequences for private sector software writers who write insecure code in commercial software is high costs for patching, along with substantial embarrassment for their companies and job insecurity for them. In contrast, the consequences for private sector software writers who write insecure code for the government is contract add-ons to fix the problem and more revenue for their companies and job security for them. You'd think they'd be really worried about someone asking a fix to a security problem, but those are just called change orders, and that's how a project manager makes his bonus. I'm not claiming that contractors aren't trying to do the right thing, but this is how the incentives are built. Also, it doesn't seem to be improving any, whereas vulnerabilities like SQL injecting and cross-site scripting have dropped in the private industry over the last 2 years, they haven't dropped at all for governments. Once again, we see how screwed up incentives make government programs much worse than their private sector counterparts. And there's no sense of organic improvements. If there isn't a regulation about it, it doesn't get done. Whereas the private sector has incentives to keep security vulnerabilities down and respond quickly to new threats and techniques. It's just more of what we see. UL makes products safer than government regulation does. ISO 9000 makes working environments better than OSHA does. The option isn't government programs or nothing. It's grossly inefficient government programs with screwed up incentive structures that have failed for thousands of years, or private initiatives that have been proven to work for well over a century. Which would you choose? And now it's time to contractually obligate this week's biggest Bogon emitter. We have problems in this country. Big problems. Mounting debt, expanding war, continued unemployment. So why is it all of a sudden this big pressing issue to stop gays from getting married? Oh, election year, right. The North Carolina General Assembly has put Amendment 1 on the ballot, which would prohibit the state from recognizing any other marriage than that of one man and one woman, and in the process, they caused every bogometer here at the Institute for Completely Bogus Studies to spontaneously combust. It begins with the ballot measure, which reads, Constitutional amendment to provide that marriage between one man and one woman is the only domestic legal union that shall be valid or recognized in this state. But that isn't the actual text of the amendment. The full amendment reads, quote, Marriage between one man and one woman is the only domestic legal union that shall be valid or recognized in this state. This section does not prohibit a private party from entering into contracts with another private party, nor does this section prohibit courts from adjudicating the rights of private parties pursuant to such contracts. This is just like saying, green is the only color of the sky that shall be valid or recognized in this state. This section does not prohibit the sky from being blue. What? Look, we all know that marriage is much more than just a contract, but the contractual aspects of marriage are the only aspects government has any business addressing. And Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution states, in part, quote, No state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. That makes any prohibition on homosexual marriage unconstitutional from the get-go. But to then turn around and say that people can make whatever contracts they want is a contradiction of the highest order. But this language also has some hideous unintended consequences. It opens the door wide for government to regulate and restrict all sorts of legal arrangements, both same-sex and different sex, even arrangements that have nothing to do with the institution of marriage. How will this affect child custody issues, for example? A similar law in Ohio ended up preventing the enforcement of domestic violence laws of unmarried couples, even when they were of opposite sex. Such consequences cannot even be imagined at the time of passage, but they will be felt by the people and probably sooner rather than later. The Constitutional Amendments Publication Commission has released an official description of the amendment that's just full of fail from start to finish. They start off by acknowledging that this is already the law in North Carolina and has been since 1996. They also acknowledge that the term domestic legal union is completely undefined, not in the amendment and not anywhere in North Carolina law. They openly admit that we don't know how the unintended consequences will play out and what it will mean for all sorts of different issues. But how do they take care of all of these problems? Quote, The courts will ultimately make those decisions. In other words, we don't have the first idea what we're voting for. This is a change to the North Carolina Constitution, the penultimate law of the state under the U.S. Constitution, and they just want us to accept these problems, saying the courts will sort it out. Unbelievable! They then go on to say that people may be able to make contractual arrangements among themselves, but would they be valid? At what point would such an agreement fall under the restrictions in this amendment? What would people, gay, straight, or otherwise, be allowed to do when they contract with each other? Their response is, quote, "The courts will decide the extent to which such contracts can be enforced." So basically the amendment says you have the right to contract except when you don't, and the courts will tell you later when that actually is. They want us to just trust them and vote for this amendment. The scary thing is, this official description was written by Democrats, whereas opposition to Amendment 1 comes from Democrats, Republicans, and Libertarians. Tripartisan opposition. Everything about this amendment is fail, 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 and here's hoping it gets voted down on May 8th, leaving this as nothing more than an annoying yet harmless act of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now it's time to Photoshop Brooklyn Lee's head to the body of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. And it's another story involving Pat Robertson. But guess what? He's not the idiot this week. In fact, he stunned the entire world of sensible people by coming out in favor of marijuana legalization. No, the fail comes from desperate drug warrior Joseph A. Califano Jr., writing in the Washington Post and making himself more idiotic than Pat Robertson. And what does he take Robertson to task for? His conclusion that, quote, "This war on drugs just hasn't succeeded." Wait a minute, a liberal reporter like Califano is for the drug war, and conservative fundamentalist Christian Pat Robertson is against this? What is this, the Twilight Zone? What's next? Rush Limbaugh running a Planned Parenthood clinic? And he trots out all the myths of the drug warriors once again. Quote, "Contrary to Robertson's belief that legalizing marijuana will reduce our nation's incarceration rates, the fact is that only 2% of all inmates are incarcerated for marijuana possession as their controlling or only offense. Thing is, most states have a threshold above which possession is considered prima facie evidence of intent to distribute, and in some cases this amount is less than 1 ounce. In Florida, for example, anything over 20 grams, just over 0.7 ounces, means you're not just possessing, you're legally a drug dealer. So how many people who only possessed marijuana were convicted as drug dealers and didn't show up in his 2% statistic? Are you ready for the scaremongering? Quote, "Indeed, legalizing marijuana will likely increase criminal activity. Some 2/3 of incarcerated felons, 1.5 million, met the medical criteria for addiction, and marijuana is commonly one of the first steps on the road to other drug addiction." Yes, he actually brought out the long-discredited gateway drug canard. Not only is it not true that smoking marijuana leads to other drugs, there is no evidence whatsoever that more people would do marijuana if it were legal, and plenty of evidence to the contrary. Watch the clever sidestepping. Quote, "Most violent felonies, such as murder, rape, and aggravated assault, occur when the perpetrator is high or drunk." Leave out the words high or, and the sentence is just as correct. Notice how he slipped in alcohol, a legal drug, in his sentence about how violent drugs make people. And marijuana is hardly known to make people aggressive. I wonder if he thinks the movie Reefer Madness was a documentary. More Bogosity, quote, "The lion's share of property crime involves people seeking money to buy drugs." Even if that is true, which it isn't, most property crimes aren't drug-related, the only reason people commit crimes to get money for drugs is because drugs are illegal. Do you ever see anyone committing crimes to score beer or ciggies? He even resorts to bogus statistics. Quote, "Today's marijuana is no harmless herb. It is 10 times more potent than the marijuana of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Hey, Califano, 10 times nothing is still nothing. And it's still the case that not one single human death in history can be linked to the toxic effects of marijuana." He spends a lot of time bleating about addiction, but of course marijuana is by far the least addictive recreational drug we know of, much less so than tobacco, alcohol, Vicodin, or even caffeine. And besides, people become addictive because of their brain structure. More and more psychiatrists are discovering that addicts have secondary diagnoses, whether it's clinical depression, undiagnosed epilepsy, or some other kind of mental, physiological, or neurological disorder. The addiction rate of the population is constant, regardless of whether drugs are legal or illegal, and treating the underlying problem is the best way to cure the addiction itself, not by making the drugs illegal so addicts are afraid to come forward and get help for fear of being arrested. And yes, there was the "won't someone think of the children" plea. He says he doesn't understand how Robertson, quote, would want to legalize a third drug like marijuana when we have shown such little ability to keep our two legal drugs, tobacco and alcohol, out of the hands of our children and teens. Of course, survey after survey shows that teens constantly report that marijuana is easier for them to get than alcohol. This is just another drug warrior in denial, and the fact that he's being more moronic than Pat, "Hurricanes are the work of the devil" Robertson is more than enough to qualify Joseph A. Califano Jr. for this week's Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this much reviled, take the child, BS piled, meek and mild, status riled, crazy tiled, stored and filed, wet and wild, man who smiled, bird beguiled, and sea compiled edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at bogosity.tv where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from George Washington. "Make the most of the Indian hemp seed and sow it everywhere." The Bugosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.
Bogosity.